Hello and welcome back, Grace Community Church, to the Cover to Cover series where we read through the entire Bible in a year. My name is Polo, and it is my pleasure to bring to you today's reading, which is April 19th. I also did yesterday's reading, which was April 18th. That was my first time doing that, but thanks again for joining in again. And today's April 19th reading is we're going to follow 1 Samuel chapter 30, that whole chapter, as well as we have a lot to read. It was First Chronicles chapter 12, verses 20 through 21, which was just a brief discussion on David's army growing and those that defected to David's army. And then as well, the First Samuel chapter 31, that entire chapter. As well, we read First Chronicles chapter 10, verses 1 through 14, which is the same account of the death of Saul. And as well, we get into the book of 2 Samuel, and then read the first chapter of 2 Samuel. And it ends with chapter 17 through 27, David commemorating Saul and Jonathan in a funeral song that he wrote and composed and made mandatory for the people of Judah to learn. But let's go back to the beginning of the reading, 1 Samuel chapter 30, verses 1 through 31, which basically picks off where David had to leave and return back to Ziklag, where he had been stationed and was initially there to get away from Saul and to kind of find safety from Saul's pursuit. So he joins the Philistine army, but is then rejected because some of the other generals and captains say, well, what if David tries to turn on us? So they end up sending David and his men back to Ziklag. So that's where 1 Samuel chapter 30 picks off. So when David and his men are traveling back to Ziklag, they find that their town has been burned and raided by the Amalekites. So like I said in the last video from yesterday, when Saul had the second chance and when David had the second chance to spare Saul's life, he's a faithful servant of God. Everything didn't go right in that moment. He still ended up getting sent back home, and not even further. Now he gets sent back home, and home is devastated. Home is gone. So he just had been faithful to God's servant who had been pursuing him, and he just been faithful to God, saying, I'm not going to take this into my own hands. And he comes back to complete and utter ruin. And it's a imagine the scene, imagine the devastation. His two wives were taken. There were children taken, cattle, belongings, and everything burned. So I can only imagine the state that he was in after saying, most of us would question, like, God, I've just been faithful. I had the opportunity to do this, and I'm trying to do everything right. But I want us to focus on, again, David's response to this and who he goes to first. So I'm going to pick up chapter 13, verses 3. When David and his men saw the ruins and realized what had happened to their families, they wept until they could weep no more. And I'm going to skip down here to verse 7, where verse 8, where it says, then David asked the Lord, should I chase after this band of raiders, and will I catch them? So the first thing he does after weeping, obviously, is his first response is to ask God on what to do next. And that shows an amazing dedication and devotion to God's direction, God's voice, and God's counsel. And this is something I think we're all called to do. And it can happen in times like this when we just were faithful to God. We could have taken things into our own hands, but we're trying to do things the right way. And then another bad thing happens to us that we feel like undeserved, or how could this happen? the first person David went to was God and said, well, should I do this? And God, to the answer, God says, yes, go after them, and you will surely recover everything that was taken from you. So there's another example of God's faithfulness, of God's partnership and covenant with David, and that he is pretty much behind David in his journey. So David and his 600 men set out, and they crossed a brook named Besor. 200 of the men stay behind because they were too exhausted to go on. So he ends up having to go on with 400 men. I'm not going to do the whole reading as we've read this, and I'm sure you read it. But David and his men end up finding an Egyptian who was a slave of the Amalekites. The Amalekites were the people that just burned David's newfound town with his men. And so this Egyptian lets them know where the Amalekites are camped at, and just says, David, I'll let you know where they are. I'll lead you to them, but promise not to return me to my master or kill me, in which David does. So this Egyptian man leads them, David and his 400, to the Amalekite camp, and David he captures everything back, just like God had said. Easy peasy. God is faithful. David's faithful to God. He captures that and everything that was there. He captures his 2 wives that were taken and captured. He gets them back, and David and his 400 return to Brook Besor, where the 200 that were too exhausted to travel on were waiting. And David says, let's split the plunder amongst ourselves. Let's celebrate. And then there was groaning and grumbling among the other soldiers, saying, no, those are the 200 that were too tired to come with us to regain when we got back. We're not sharing with them. And David says, that's not the type of kingdom. That's not the type of decision I want to make here. And from that day on, it was said that there was a precedent set that even those that stay on watch over the equipment and things like that, they're still they're treated as equal, basically. So David was showing his faithfulness to even those that were tired at the time. You're still going to need them, and they're still faithful to the army. There's no need to spread negativity amongst the camp and amongst soldiers because they weren't unable to make this trip and journey where we easily did, and God, led them into our hands. So that was another thing where it shows not only just integrity, but leadership in tough situations where you have even your own men saying, well, why are we doing this? And David says, because we're faithful, and this is the type of men we are. So he's setting a standard there. And then as well, the first Chronicles from chapter 12 to 20, it's just a basic 6,000 troops that defected to David. And as we move on through the reading for the 19th, we get to the death of Saul. And it's kind of like David had foresaw that he had the chance the second time to kill Saul, but he told his servant at the time, no, he's either going to die of old age or in battle, and that's in God's hands. And Saul ends up dying in battle with the Philistines, and the Bible describes it as the battle's fierce, and they die on Mount Gilboa, and he dies with his 3 sons, one of whom is David's good friend, or was David's good friend, Jonathan. So at 1 Samuel chapter 31 deals with the death of Saul and kind of the entering of a new era and a new chapter there. And then the same thing is repeated in 1 Chronicles chapter 10, is the death of Saul by the Philistines, and how the battle is fierce around Saul, and they're encroaching in on them, and Saul wants to be put out of his misery. He falls on his own sword because his armor bearer was too scared to do it. But Saul knows it's the end, and the Bible makes note that the Lord killed him because he had consulted a medium, as well as God had turned the kingdom over to David. So it was a new beginning for the kingdom of Israel. And as well, we read Jonathan's descendants in honor of Jonathan. And then in 1 Samuel, we had a quick brief reading, 1 Samuel chapter 4, verses 4, which described Mephibosheth, Jonathan's son, and how he got crippled, and that was among hearing the news of Jonathan dying. The servant that had the child at the time had ran in the news of hearing Jonathan's death and had fell and dropped Mephibosheth, and that's how Mephibosheth was crippled. And then we pick up in 2 Samuel chapter 1, verses 1 through 16, where David learns of Saul's death. And in that it closes with a psalm or a hymn, a funeral song that was written and composed by David for Saul and his son Jonathan, who David loved and admired and respected. And it just shows you his not only courage and honor, respect, love, but his dedication to doing the things that are right. Not only his heart and his compassion for Saul and his son Jonathan and his sons. And it ends on a pretty somber note, our reading ends on a pretty somber note, as it's pretty much a funeral song to Saul, but it's written by David. And that, to me, speaks volumes as far as how we are to act as Christians, even if there could be multiple ways of looking at it. From reading, several people might read the stories. Why is David even compassionate? Why does he care? And even today, we have some people in our lives that might encourage us. Why do you care about so-and-so? Or why would you care about this person that only wants to see wrong for you? And the correct answer is, I care because God cares. I care because that shouldn't change how I care about the people. That shouldn't change how I respect people that I know may not have the same respect for me. I'm going to honor God through honoring those around me. And that, to me, is a prime example of, loving your neighbor like you love yourself, and being, an example of God's grace and love. So this is pretty longer than I thought it would be, but I thank you guys for joining me on the April 18th readings and the April 19th readings. My name is Polo, and until next time we see each other, may God keep you safe from all harm.